Nobody at the funeral knew that Grandpa Ned had just become the most dangerous man in the room. He stood at the back of the chapel, leaning heavily on his carved oak cane, watching his granddaughter Sarah dab at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Her father, Ned's son-in-law, Richard Chen, delivered the eulogy for his own father with the practiced smoothness of a man who'd spent 40 years closing business deals. But Ned wasn't listening to the words. He was watching Richard's hands, the way they gripped the podium edges just a fraction too tightly, the microscopic tremor that betrayed what the polished exterior concealed. Richard Chen was terrified, and he had every right to be. 3 days earlier, Ned had signed the final papers. $15 billion worth of shares in Chen Technologies, accumulated over 18 years through a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore trusts, and proxy investors so complex that even the SEC's best forensic accountants would need a decade to unravel it. The anonymous investor that analysts had speculated about for years, the ghost in the machine who'd quietly accumulated 31% of the company, enough to override Richard's control, had a name now, at least on paper, locked in a Singapore vault. Edward Ned Morrison, retired postal worker, widower, grandfather of 3. The man everyone thought spent his days fishing and falling asleep during jeopardy. Ned shifted his weight, his hip aching from standing too long. He was 82 years old, and he looked every day of it, liver-spotted hands, wispy white hair, the slight stoop of age. Sarah glanced back at him with a worried smile, mouthing, "You okay?" He nodded, waving her off. His darling granddaughter. She had no idea that her grandfather could buy and sell her father's empire 3 times over. More importantly, she had no idea that her husband, Michael, sitting beside her with his arm around her shoulders, was completely in the dark about who really controlled his father-in-law's fate. The irony wasn't lost on Ned. Michael Chen, brilliant, driven, insufferably proud, had married Sarah 7 years ago, and in all that time, he'd never once suspected that the doddering old man who needed help programming his TV remote was the puppet master pulling strings in the Chen family boardroom. "Dad built this company from nothing," Richard was saying, his voice carrying across the chapel. "He taught me that loyalty, integrity, and family come first, always." Ned suppressed a bitter smile. Loyalty, integrity, family. He remembered the night, 12 years ago, when he'd overheard Richard on the phone in his study. Sarah had asked Ned to stay with them while recovering from a minor surgery, and Ned had gotten up for a glass of water around midnight. Richard's voice had carried down the hallway. "The old man's fine for now, but once he's gone, Sarah's inheritance goes into the trust. I'll control it all. She doesn't need to know the details. It's too complicated for her to understand anyway." That's when Ned had started paying attention, really paying attention. He'd spent 35 years as a postal worker, true enough. But what people forgot, what everyone always forgot, was that he'd spent 5 years before that as a junior analyst at Goldman Sachs, until his wife's illness had forced him to take a stable job with good benefits close to home. He'd walked away from Wall Street, but Wall Street had never quite left his blood. So he'd started watching Richard, watching how Chen Technologies moved, watching the quarterly reports, the analyst calls, the carefully orchestrated media appearances. And he'd seen what his granddaughter's husband, brilliant, trusting Michael, couldn't or wouldn't see. Richard Chen was systematically positioning himself to shut his own son out of the company succession. Michael believed his father was grooming him. Michael spent 70 hours a week proving himself, thinking each brutal assignment was a test he needed to pass. But Ned could read the board minutes, could see the shell companies Richard was establishing, the way key patents were being transferred to entities that Michael had no stake in. Richard was building an empire he could pass to outsiders, to yes men, to anyone but his idealistic son, who kept pushing for environmental reforms and fair labor practices that might cut into profit margins. The service ended. Ned accepted condolences from people who'd forgotten his name, patting hands and nodding sympathetically. Sarah hugged him tightly. "Grandpa, you want to ride with us to the cemetery?" "I'll take my own car, sweetheart. These old bones need to stretch." Michael appeared at her side, loosening his tie. He looked exhausted, grief and stress etched into the lines around his eyes. "Ned, you sure? It's no trouble." "I'm sure, my boy." Ned studied his grandson-in-law's face, 34 years old, a good man, too good perhaps for the world his father inhabited. "How are you holding up?" Michael's expression flickered. "It's complicated. Dad and I had plans to meet next week about the succession plan. Now I don't know what happens." "Now you're going to find out what your father really thought of your plans," Ned thought, "unless I do something about it." "Give it time," Ned said aloud. "These things have a way of working themselves out." At the cemetery, Ned stood apart from the family, watching through the grey November drizzle as Richard accepted condolences, played the grieving son, schmoozed with board members who'd flown in from 3 continents. The man was already campaigning, already consolidating power. Ned's phone buzzed. His lawyer, the only person who knew the full scope of what Ned had built. "Papers filed, 31.2% voting shares confirmed in your name. You're the largest shareholder. What's your move?" Ned typed slowly with arthritic fingers. "Nothing yet. Let me think." The truth was, he'd never wanted this power. He'd acquired the shares defensively, piece by piece, year by year, because he'd seen what Richard was capable of and knew that someday Michael might need protection. But wielding that power meant revealing himself. It meant destroying any possibility of remaining the invisible grandfather, the harmless old man nobody paid attention to. It meant Sarah would know he'd been lying to her, not directly perhaps, but by omission, for nearly 2 decades. "Grandpa," Sarah appeared beside him, holding an umbrella over his head. "You're getting soaked." He hadn't noticed, just thinking, "Sweetheart." "About Grandma." His wife, Helen, had died 20 years ago. She'd known about the beginning of his investments, had encouraged them actually. "Put something away for the kids," she'd said. "Richard gives me a bad feeling." Helen's instincts had been perfect, as always. "Always about Grandma," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. They walked toward the cars. Michael was standing with his father, listening intently as Richard spoke in low tones. From Richard's body language, the hand on Michael's shoulder, the earnest expression, Ned could tell the performance was beginning. The sympathetic father, the mentor preparing to deliver hard truths. "Son, the board thinks you're not ready. Son, we need someone with more experience. Son, I'm bringing in outside management, but you'll have a role, don't worry." "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" Sarah's voice pulled him back. "Of course." "Did you ever feel like Michael's dad doesn't take him seriously? Michael won't talk about it, but I can tell something's wrong. Dad's been different lately with him." Ned looked at his granddaughter's worried face. She worked as a pediatric nurse, spent her days caring for sick children, came home exhausted, but always made time for family dinners and visiting her aging grandfather. She deserved better than the deception he'd wrapped around himself. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I could help Michael? With his father, with the company situation?" She looked puzzled. "Grandpa, that's sweet, but it's complicated business stuff. Dad owns the company." "Not entirely. What if someone had enough shares to influence things, to protect Michael's interests?" Sarah smiled indulgently. "Then Michael would be lucky to have that person on his side. But that would be like a billionaire investor or something. Those people don't help out of kindness." Ned watched Michael shake his father's hand, watched the young man's shoulders slump slightly as he walked back towards Sarah. Whatever Richard had told him, it hadn't been good news. "You'd be surprised," Ned said quietly, "what people do for family." That evening, Ned sat in his small apartment, the same rent-controlled place he'd lived in for 40 years, and stared at his laptop screen. Open in multiple tabs were the financial statements of Chen Technologies, the corporate governance documents, the shareholder agreements. With a few phone calls, he could trigger a proxy fight, force a board meeting, expose Richard's shell companies and offshore maneuvers, install Michael as CEO with Ned's backing. But he'd also expose himself. The anonymous investor would have a face. Sarah would know her grandfather had lied. Michael would know his success wasn't entirely his own merit. And Richard would become an enemy who knew exactly where the threat came from. His phone rang. Michael. Ned, sorry to bother you. Is Sarah there? No, son, what's wrong? A long pause, then, Dad told me today that the board wants to bring in an outside CEO. He says he fought for me, but they don't think I'm ready. I have to stay on as COO for 5 more years, prove myself. Ned, I've been there for 12 years. I've increased efficiency by 40%, pushed through the sustainability initiatives that analysts love, and it's still not enough. Ned closed his eyes. What will you do? What can I do? He owns the company. The board follows his lead. I either accept it or leave, and if I leave, Sarah and I lose everything, the house, the lifestyle. Her dad would probably cut us off entirely. I'm trapped. You're not trapped, Ned thought. You just don't know you have an ally who can move mountains. Michael, let me ask you something. If you could change this situation, if you had the power to stand up to your father, what would you do? I'd run the company the right way. Treat employees fairly, invest in clean technology, build something sustainable instead of just extracting maximum profit. But that's a fantasy, Ned. My father will never give up control. What if he didn't have a choice? What do you mean? Ned took a breath, 82 years old. He'd thought he could take this secret to his grave, leave the shares in a trust for Sarah, let it all work out after he was gone. But watching good people suffer when you had the power to help them, that was its own kind of torture. Come see me tomorrow, Ned said. Both you and Sarah, I need to tell you something about your father's company and about me. Ned, you're worrying me. Are you okay? I'm fine, but there are things you should know, things that might change how you see this situation. After Michael hung up, Ned sat in the darkness of his apartment, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated ordinary life, the modest furniture, the photos of grandchildren, the shelf of mystery novels. Tomorrow he would tell them. Tomorrow he would stop being Grandpa Ned who needed help with his computer. Tomorrow he would become the man who'd spent 18 years building a weapon to protect his family, and finally reveal that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody sees coming. He thought of Helen, wished she were here to tell him he was doing the right thing, but he could almost hear her voice. Stop hiding, Ede, our family needs you. Ned opened his email and began typing to his lawyer. Schedule the emergency shareholder meeting. It's time. The anonymous investor was about to come out of the shadows.